and I haven't met you, please let me know what your name is, and I'll try to remember. When I teach, I generally like to go through a theme or a topic or the book of the Bible, and I'll teach for 4 to 8 or 10 weeks consecutively. And I think if I were to try to start an 8-week series this morning, that might be a little presumptuous. So I need to do a one-off class, and I don't excel in one-off classes. So what I wanted to do is give you guys a tool for reading the Bible that will hopefully make more sense out of some passages. So when you see what I have to show you, that maybe there will be some passages that kind of come to life for you in a way that maybe they haven't before. So we're going to be in Deuteronomy 17. That's where we're going to start. You can open to that if you want to follow along. Deuteronomy 17, starting in verse 14, we have the commands concerning the king in Israel. So when Israel comes into the land, there's going to be a point where they decide they want to have a king. And you guys may remember the story from 1 Samuel chapter 8. We'll look at that eventually. And when they get to asking for a king, this is not something that God didn't know they were going to do. He had a plan for this. And he's already laid out stipulations for what the king is supposed to do and what kind of person he's supposed to be. And we find that in Deuteronomy 17. So look with me at verse 14. When you come to the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and you possess it and dwell in it, and then say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me, you may indeed set a king over you whom the Lord your God will choose. One from among your brothers you shall set as king over you. You may not put a foreigner over you who is not your brother. Only he must not acquire many horses for himself, or cause the people to return to Egypt in order to acquire more horses, since the Lord has said to you, you shall never return that way again. And he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he acquire for himself excessive silver and gold. We'll just stop right there. Now, what did you see as stipulations for the king? If you were going to name some things, the king has to be this, he has to do this, can't do this, here are the boundaries, what do you notice?
Be one of them.
He has to be one of them. I'm going to call that, he has to be a native Israelite. Oh, that's too high. It's going to mess me up later. All right. And what is your name?
Scott.
Scott. Thank you. All right. He's got to be a native Israelite. What else do we see?
Chosen by God.
He needs to be chosen.
And don't go back to Egypt.
Don't go back to Egypt in order to acquire many horses. I'm going to come back to that in just a second. What is your name?
Joyce.
Joyce. Nice to meet you, Joyce. I'm Parker. What else do we notice?
Not a lot of wives.
Not a lot of wives. Okay. How many wives is too many wives? Be careful, gentlemen.
Depends on who you ask.
So every time I've done this, somebody has joked, one is too many wives. Is two too many wives? How many wives did Jacob have?
Too many.
He had two, and then he had 2 handmaidens. So 2, 4, depends on how you kind of classify a wife. You know how many kings David had? Or how many wives King David had? More than Jacob. Okay, so we'll get there. Well, okay, so how many is too many? We don't have like a hard and fast number. But I think the point is that he is not to build for himself a harem of women. So when you start thinking about kings like Xerxes, Nebuchadnezzar, Ashurbanipal, Tiglath-Pileser, they've got a harem of women. You remember the story of Esther. For 6 months, every night, he has a new woman until he comes to Esther. That's a harem. That is, the king in Israel is not to have a harem. Oh, I should put no harem. Okay? What else do you notice?
He's supposed to write himself a scroll and read it every day.
Okay, we haven't gotten there, Sharon.
Oh, I'm sorry, did I go too far?
You're a little too far.
I went too far.
Yeah.
Whoops.
No large amount of gold and silver.
All right, I think James and Steve said the same thing. So, how much is too much gold? Can he have a nugget of gold? Can he have a bar of gold? Can he have multiple necklaces, chains of gold drenched around him, and a gold ring on each finger? I think the idea here is that he's not supposed to flaunt wealth. He's not supposed to build for himself a big personal estate. Okay, so I'm going to call that no estate, but that's what we're referring to. Okay, no estate. No big lots of silver and gold. And then there's one other that we haven't mentioned yet. He can't have many wives, can't have much silver, and he can't have many horses. Okay. Horses in the Bible are war animals. They're not beasts of burden. You don't use them to plow your fields. You don't use them for travel. When Jesus comes into Jerusalem, he's not riding a horse. He's riding a donkey. That's interesting. What would you expect a king to be riding when he comes into his capital city? You expect him to be riding a horse because it's a military animal. The horse and the chariot are like the tanks of the ancient world. To have many horses, and again, how many is many? But to have many horses is to have a large standing professional military. Now, keep a finger in chapter 17, but flip over to chapter 20 for just a second. When you go out to war against your enemies, and you see horses and chariots and an army larger than your own, you shall not be afraid of them. For the Lord your God is with you, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. And when you draw near to battle, the priest shall come forward and speak to the people and say to them, Hear, O Israel, today you're drawing near for battle against your enemies. Who is speaking to them? Who's at the front of the army? A priest. And who is he speaking to? Professional soldiers? It says, Hear, O Israel. The people are the ones that rise up. Okay. Don't fear or panic or be in dread of your enemies, for the Lord is with you. And then the officers shall speak to the people. It's interesting, there are officers saying, Is there any man who has built a new house and hasn't dedicated it? You go back and dedicate your house. Is there anybody who has a vineyard that hasn't produced its first crop? You go back and tend to your vineyard. Is there anyone who's betrothed a wife and hasn't yet gotten married? You go home and get married. Is there anybody who's just afraid and wants to go home? You just go ahead and go home. It kind of sounds like they're being invited to a wedding feast in one of Jesus' parables, doesn't it? Anyway, for Jesus, the invitation to join the kingdom is an invitation to a wedding feast, and people respond like they're being called into battle. That's fascinating. Okay, so anyway, that's a different lesson. What are we talking about? Oh, so these people, they're farmers. They're vintners, right? They grow vineyards and they are building houses. They're not professional soldiers. They're farmers with pitchforks and torches. That's how Israel is supposed to fight. The king is not supposed to have a big professional standing military. When there's a threat against Israel, the farmers rise up, and he leads them. You think about Saul. Does anybody remember what King Saul was doing when he found out that one of his towns was under attack? So his first act as king. What was he doing? He was plowing with his oxen. He's out in the field. That's the kind of thing that kings do in Israel. But you don't see Nebuchadnezzar or Ashurbanipal or Xerxes doing that kind of thing. Now, going back to what Joyce said, Joyce brought up that they're not to go back to Egypt in order to acquire many horses. So not only can the king not have many horses, he's not allowed to go to other nations, and especially Egypt, in order to get horses. Okay, so you guys can't build missiles for yourselves, and you're not allowed to just bypass that by going to the next nation over and using their missiles either. When there's a threat, you trust in God, and God will protect you. Consequently, when Jerusalem is under attack in the last part of the 8th century by Assyria, Isaiah is the big prophet at the time, and Isaiah criticizes the king because he goes to Egypt to make an alliance with Egypt to save him from Assyria. And Isaiah says, trust in God. God will save you. But because you have leaned on Egypt, Egypt is like a broken reed that will pierce your hand when you lean on it. So, I'm going to call that no alliances. But we all know what I mean by this. Now, does this mean you can't have an economic alliance? I don't know that you would have just an economical alliance, but that's what I'm referring to. Okay, now, let's back in chapter 17. How am I doing? Is there a clock in here? How am I doing on time?
You'll get a 5-minute bell.
I need like a bell every 5 minutes. Okay. All right, let's look at verse 18. And when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself in a book a copy of this law approved by the Levitical priests, and it shall be with him, and he shall read in it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God by keeping all the words of this law and these statutes and doing them, that his heart may not be lifted up above his brothers, and that he may not turn aside from the commandment either to the right hand or to the left, so that he may continue long in his kingdom, he and his children in Israel. Now, Sharon,
Yes.
what is the king supposed to do?
He's supposed to write a scroll and read it every day.
He's supposed to write a scroll and read it every day. Now, my Bible says that he shall write for himself in a book or in a scroll a copy of this law. When Deuteronomy, which was originally written in Hebrew, was translated into Greek, the word for copy of this law was rendered with one word, Deuteronomion. Deuteronomy. That's where we get the word Deuteronomy. That's just for free. Now, he's supposed to copy it out. A lot of people, I think, don't realize this. How many copies of Deuteronomy are there in existence in the days of the kings of Israel? You want to take a guess?
One.
You have one copy that the king has, and you have one copy that the priests have. The priestly copy is rolled up and it's leaning against the Ark of the Covenant. So if you were to go into the Holy of Holies, you would see the Ark of the Covenant and the book of Deuteronomy right there, which tells you something about how important that book is. And then the king has his copy. Your average Joe Israelite doesn't read the Bible. He doesn't have a Bible. He didn't know how to read anyway. And so it's not like they're having home Bible studies, going over Deuteronomy and learning the 10 Commandments and all that. They're only exposed to it once every 7 years when they come and hear the book of the law read. And even that doesn't actually happen until the days of Ezra, hundreds of years later. But the king is supposed to write and read and reflect on and meditate on the law every day. So I'm going to call this that he's supposed to be the designated Bible nerd. The king is not a legislator. He doesn't create new laws. What kind of king in the ancient world doesn't create new laws? But he doesn't get to do that. He's not like Congress creating legislation or creating new programs. He's more like the Supreme Court, that his job is to read and interpret the founding document. Does that make sense? Is that a fair analogy? He's more like the Supreme Court. So, you have these two women that come to King Solomon, and they have this complaint. They're both claiming that this child is theirs. And his job is to make a decision. He pronounces verdicts. That's what kings do. Okay. So, a good biblical king is supposed to be a native of Israel. He needs to be chosen by God. He's not to have this harem of women, one on each arm, like Bruce Wayne getting out of the limo, right? That's not supposed to be him. He's not supposed to have lots of silver and gold, many horses. He's not supposed to go to Egypt and use their horses either. Instead, he's supposed to be a Bible nerd that reads and meditates on the law every day. Okay. Are we all good? Does all make sense? Now, let me show you a few passages that this might throw some light on. Turn over to 1 Samuel chapter 8. We'll pick up in verse 4. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, Behold, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations. But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, Give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed, and the Lord said to Samuel, Obey and give them a king. Look down now at verse 11. Samuel said, These will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots, to be his horsemen and to run before his chariots. Good thing, bad thing? Bad thing. That's a bad thing. Okay. And he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and some to plow for himself and to reap his harvest and to make his implements of war and the equipment of his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He'll take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his servants. He will take the tenth of your grain and of your vineyards and give it to his officers and to his servants. He will take your male servants and female servants and the best of your young men and your donkeys and put them to his work. He'll take the tenth of your flock, and you shall be his slaves. And in that day you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves. But the Lord will not answer you in that day. Is this a good king, bad king? Does this sound like this kind of king? The problem is, it's a king that you have chosen for yourselves. When the people choose their own king, they wind up choosing, okay, they choose natives, but they're going to wind up choosing a king that is all about climbing to the top of the pyramid and flaunting his wealth and flaunting his power and amassing for himself an army, and he's going to conscript into slavery his own people so that he can be decked out in the gold with a woman on each arm. Does that make sense? When the people choose their own king. Now, if God chooses a king, it's not going to be like that. At least it's not supposed to be. All right. Now, the writers of the books of Samuel and Kings, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, they love Deuteronomy. And they use Deuteronomy as a rubric to evaluate the kings. So whenever you read about a new king that comes along, whether he's in the north or in the south, it'll say, there's this King Jobab, and he reigned for 12 years, and his mother was named Libnah, and he did evil in the sight of the Lord. Does that formula kind of sound familiar if you've read through Kings? Okay. How do they make the evaluation whether a king is a good king or a bad king? This is how they do it. So let's think about some kings that we know, and let's try to evaluate whether we think they're good kings or bad kings. Who's the first king that comes to your mind in the Old Testament? David, of course, it's David. All right. Is David a native Israelite? Yes, he is. Is David chosen by God? Yes, he is. How many wives does David have? I already asked that. David has 8 wives that we know of. How many wives is too many wives? Some of y'all said 1. Maybe we could say 2. Jacob has 2 wives. But I'm going to say 8 is probably too many. I think that's encroaching on this woman on each arm thing. Does he have a large personal estate? When you think of David, do you think of silver and gold? This means yes, this means no. That's how, in Colorado. I don't know how you guys do it here in Texas. No, I don't either. I don't think of silver and gold when I think of David, and I'm not aware of any tradition anywhere in the Bible that connects David with having a lot of wealth. So I'm going to go ahead and say, yeah, sure. He passes. He passes that one. Does David have professional soldiers? You were king. Okay, so 2 Samuel 23. 24, sorry. No, 20, it is 23. These are the names, this is verse 8. These are the names of the mighty men whom David had. Yosheb-Bashevath, a Techmonite. He was chief of the three. He wielded his spear against 800 whom he killed at one time. Oh, you guys remember old Yosheb? And how, you remember the time that he single-handedly took on the Philistines and slayed 800 with his spear. And next to him was, among the three mighty men, was Eleazar, the son of Dodo, son of Ahohi. He was with David when they defied the Philistines, who were gathered there for battle, and the men of Israel withdrew. He rose and struck down the Philistines until his hand was weary, and yet his hand clung to his sword. And the Lord brought about a great victory that day, and the men returned after him only to strip the slain. And next to him was Shammah, the son of Agi, the Hararite. The Philistines gathered together at Lehi, where there was a plot of ground full of lentils, and the men fled from the Philistines. He took his stand in the midst of the plot and defended it and struck down the Philistines, and the Lord worked a great victory. And so it goes. And then the last paragraph of the chapter, you get this list of names of all of his mighty men. And if you're an Israelite and you're reading over these stories, the music starts to swell in the background. Right? These are the great heroes. Is this a good thing? Is he supposed to have people like this? No, he's not. Look at chapter 24. Again, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. And he incited David against them, saying, "Go and number Israel and Judah." Why is the Lord angry with David? And why is out of his anger, he tells David to go count his people? Have you ever wondered that? I think it's because of this. I think David fails here. And the genius of the storytelling is if you have ever read across that and kind of heard the patriotic music swelling in the background, you stepped right into the trap. Because that's not what the Lord wants from his people. These great war heroes. Does David make any alliances with foreign powers for his defense? This is not the most famous part of his story, but when he's on the run from his sons who are trying to claim the throne from him, he goes and hides among the Philistines. And the Philistines protect him. So, you may call that alliance. Maybe you don't. I'll go ahead and put a question mark there and let you decide. Is David a Bible nerd? Think about the Psalms. Do we ever hear David in the Psalms saying, "Oh, how I love your law. I meditate on it day and night"? Things like that. Yes. Okay, so there's a tradition that connects David with reading the Bible. It's not in the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, but it's in the Psalms. So I'm going to go ahead and give him a pass there, even though 1st and 2nd Samuel doesn't ever have him reading the Bible. Now, who's the next king after David? Does anybody remember? Solomon. Okay. Is Solomon a native? Yes, he is. Is Solomon chosen by God?
Yes.
He kind of. I mean, God makes this covenant with him, makes this agreement with him. But does he choose Solomon the way that he chose David out of the field? Not so much. What he does is he chooses David and makes a covenant with David that his offspring will always be the ones on the throne. So Solomon is there kind of by default because God chose his daddy. So I'll give him a pass because he's going to need it. Does Solomon have a harem? Does Solomon have wealth? Does Solomon have a military? Okay, turn to 1 Kings chapter 10. Starting in verse 14. Now the weight of the gold that came to Solomon in 1 year was 666 talents of gold, besides that which came from the explorers and from the business of the merchants and from all the kings of the west and from the governors of the land. King Solomon made 200 large shields of beaten gold. 600 shekels of gold went into each shield. He made 300 shields of beaten gold. 3 minas of gold went into each shield. And the king put them in his summer home, the forest of Lebanon. The king also made a great ivory throne and overlaid it with the finest gold. The throne had 6 steps, and the throne had a round top, and on each side of the seat were armrests and 2 lions standing beside the armrests, while 12 lions stood there, one on each end of a step of the 6 steps. So he's got like 14 mountain lions surrounding him that are all just trained to sit there and intimidate people. The like of it were never made in any kingdom. All of King Solomon's drinking vessels were of gold, and all the vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon were pure gold. None were of silver. Silver wasn't worth anything in the days of Solomon. For the king had a fleet of ships of Tarshish at sea with the fleet of Hiram, and once every 3 years the fleet of ships of Tarshish used to come bringing gold, silver, ivory, apes, and peacocks. Thus King Solomon excelled all the kings of the earth in riches and, interestingly, in wisdom. And the whole earth sought the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom which God had put into his mind. Every one of them brought his present, articles of silver and gold, garments, myrrh, spices, horses, mules, so much year by year. And Solomon gathered together chariots and horsemen. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horsemen, whom he stationed in the chariot cities. He has cities just to keep his chariots in. And Solomon, the king of Solomon's import of horses, in verse 28, where does he get his horses? From Egypt. And the king's traders received them from Cu at a price. And then you get the price. Chapter 11. Now King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women from the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the people, you shall not intermarry with them, neither shall they with you, for surely they'll turn your hearts away after other gods. These are the ones that Solomon clung to in love. He had 700 wives who were princesses and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. Does Solomon have a harem? Does Solomon have a large personal estate? How about a military?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Does he make alliances? Yes. Is he a Bible nerd? Does Solomon ever read the Bible?
No.
Not that I'm aware of. I don't know of any passage that ever has Solomon reading the Bible. It says that he's wise, but his wise is like downloaded out of the cloud. Like he doesn't learn it. He just receives it from God. So I'm going to say no. You may disagree with me. That's fine. But I like to have a lot of X's. Okay. Now I said other kings get evaluated on these same lines. So for example, King Josiah. Does anybody remember who Josiah is? What's his big story? He was young. And what does he find? He finds the book of the law. Right? He's the one who starts this campaign to refurbish the temple. Katie and I like to watch Hometown. I don't know if you guys watch Hometown with Ben and Aaron. We love that show. That's what he's doing to the temple. He's going to renovate the temple. And when they go into the Holy of Holies to like redo the plaster or whatever, they find this book that nobody has been reading. Nobody even knows what it is. And it's the book of Deuteronomy. Because there it is, leaning against the Ark of the Covenant. And when Josiah reads it, he puts it into effect. He starts going around and doing what Deuteronomy says to do. So in 2 Kings chapter 24, I have it written down. I have notes, I'm just... Where is it? 23, chapter 23, verse 25. Before him, before Josiah, there was no king like him, who turned to the Lord with all of his heart and all of his soul and with all of his might. With all of it's the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God. You shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart and all of your soul and all of his might. According to the law of Moses, nor did any arise after him. Before him, there was nobody like Josiah. And after him, nobody like Josiah. Not even David gets that kind of praise. Josiah is the greatest king in Israel. Why? He's a native. He's part of David's family. He's chosen. We don't know that he's even married at all, let alone that he has a harem. We don't know if he has any gold or silver. Whatever he has seems to be going into the temple. He's not building a big estate. We don't know anything about any kind of military that he builds. We don't know anything about any kind of alliances. But if he's reading Deuteronomy, he knows better than that. And he is the only king in all of Samuel and all of Kings that is ever said to actually read the text. David has that tradition, but that's in the Psalms. He is the only king who is ever said to read the Bible. So he gets a big fat check mark. There was no king like him before, and there's no king like him after. Now, you guess which king I'm going to talk about next. Come now. Give you a hint, he's not in the Old Testament. Jesus. Is Jesus a native? Is he a native of Israel? Yes, he is. Is he chosen by God? Yes, that's what the word Christ means. Does Jesus have a whole bunch of wives? How many brides does Jesus have? One. The church. Does Jesus have a large personal estate? Is he walking around decked out in gold and silver? No. Does he have a professional standing military? Is there anybody in the church whose job it is to wield a sword in his name? That's like what they do for a living. No. Does the church make alliances with foreign powers so that we can use their violence to protect us? That way we don't have to trust God. No. Is Jesus a Bible nerd? Oh, yes. Not only does he read Deuteronomy, not only is Deuteronomy the most quoted book in Jesus' mouth, but he is the one who spoke Deuteronomy into existence, is he not? You want to talk about a Bible nerd. He gets checks all the way down too, but I'm running out of time. Now, with the time we have left, which is about 9 minutes. I did that a lot faster. I do have time for check marks. I want to share a theory with you. This is something that the more I think about it, the more interesting it becomes to me. And you guys can knock this around in your own brains and see if you agree or what you think of this. When Paul goes to talk about the leadership of the church, he's a guy who is steeped in the language of the scriptures. His worldview has been formed by Deuteronomy. And when he talks about elders and deacons, he doesn't use the same kind of language, but he's drinking from the same pool. Does that make sense? So look over at 1 Timothy 3. The saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a noble task. Therefore, an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of how many wives? One wife. Sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach. Not a drunkard, not violent, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. He must manage his own household well with all dignity, keeping his children submissive. For if someone doesn't know how to manage his own household, how will he care for God's church? He must not be a recent convert, or he may become puffed up with conceit and fall into the condemnation of the devil. Moreover, he must be well thought of by outsiders, so that he may not fall into disgrace. into a snare of your belly. Nobody is native to the church. Nobody's born, even if you're a cradle Christian, at some point you have to make the decision for yourself. Nobody is a native, but he's not to be a recent convert. He needs to be someone who is steeped in the ways of our people, if I can put it that way. Is he chosen by God? This passage doesn't address that so much, but you think about Ephesians 4, where Christ gave some to be apostles and prophets and evangelists and shepherds and teachers. When the grace of God enters us, grace not only is pardon, but it is the power to act in the world differently. And with that power comes certain responsibilities. For some, it is the responsibility to show hospitality. For others, it is the responsibility to be generous. And for others, it is the responsibility to eld. Elders, I believe, are chosen and empowered by God for the task. The church doesn't make anybody an elder. The church just recognizes that this person has been gifted by God to care for the church. No harem. Now, I realize that there is debate about this term. It's not monogenes, that's only begotten, but it's something close to that. I know that there are debates about elders being widowed. If he's widowed, then he's no longer a husband. And so can he still serve as an elder? I've heard of churches that release their elders, decommission, I don't know what word you would use, because his wife passed away. If he's remarried, or if he's divorced, I realize that those are all issues, but one thing that is certainly ruled out is polygamy. He is not to have a harem of wives. He is to be a one-woman man. Is he to be greedy for gain, for gold? No, he's not supposed to be greedy. Not violent, but gentle. Well thought of by outsiders. And able to teach. The job, I think, of church leadership is to know the Bible and to teach the Bible. Because that's what leaders do in God's kingdom. All right. I think I have time for questions. I should, yeah, because the bell hasn't rung. Any thoughts or questions on any of this?
It's good to see it in that way.
How so?
Because then you're doing the comparison. And you're getting to see all of it at one time. Mm-hmm. And not just bits and pieces here and there.
Okay. Yes?
What did they do with the copies they were supposed to have made after that king passed, and then they're supposed to write it every year. So what did they do with their old copies of the law that they were supposed to have written?
Well, that's an interesting question. What is your name?
Eddie.
Eddie?
Betty.
Betty. A couple of responses to that. One is that we don't have any record that I'm aware of what they did. Another is if Josiah finds the book of the law and nobody even knows what it is, that tells me it's been a long time since anybody has actually done what Deuteronomy says to do. There's a big difference between what Deuteronomy prescribes and then what actually happens. Right? And then a third thing is archaeological evidence suggests that scrolls last only about 40 years before they're so dilapidated they're just not worth anything. And so the scrolls would, if they're going to be preserved, need to be rewritten about every 40 years anyway. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, because I was thinking it never talks about any of them that copied it. I don't hear of Saul, David.
Yeah.
I don't read of anyone.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any passage that tells us that either. Any other thoughts or questions or rude remarks? Insults?
Just out of curiosity, what version of the Bible are you reading from?
That's the English Standard.
Okay.
Did this help? Are there passages now that you feel like you understand what's happening in that passage a little bit better?
Oh yeah.
Okay. That was my goal. I want to give you a tool that will help you read the Bible better. I want to equip you guys.
The other thing is, you said that you didn't think Josiah was married, yet he had children. So don't you think he did have wives
There you go. He probably does have. I would imagine he does.
or concubines?
All right. Well, I guess you guys get to have a few extra minutes of going to get your coffee and take a little extra time in the restroom. Yeah, Scott. Is it Scott? Is that right?
But one other interesting thing that Josiah was, because God was still mad at Israel, or at Judah, he didn't make it long.
Mm.
And he was killed.
Yeah, Josiah doesn't make it all that long.
It's just a few verses in the Bible he's talked about. And then you'd almost think, well, didn't he get a pass because
Well,
he came back into the Bible, to the scripture?
yeah, Josiah dies in battle, of all things. And he does get a couple of chapters, and he does get all this high praise. But it's either his daddy or his granddaddy, Manasseh, is the most wicked king that Israel ever saw. And it's like he did so much damage that everything Josiah does in trying to turn the ship around, it's too little too late. But he gets a pass. He doesn't see the kingdom fall. It's like his nephew, I think, that sees it fall. Alright. Well, I really appreciate you guys' attention. Go get more coffee, take a little extra time in the bathroom. And if I haven't met you, I want to shake hands and learn names as best I can. Thank you.